The night before the Battle of Bach Dang in 1288, the river seemed alive, its waters breathing with the lunar pull. They whispered secrets against 1,000 of sharpened wooden stakes planted by the Dai Viet soldiers. Silent guardians poised to tear open the hulls of any enemy ship foolish enough to enter at the wrong moment. Asterisk before we get into main content. Please consider subscribing to my channel, giving a like, leaving a comment, and share and support me in bringing more great videos to you. Thank you so much. Asterisk Tran Hung Dao stood watch on a small hill, overlooking the river's wide mouth where it met the sea. The salty wind whipped his armor as he surveyed the vast expanse before him. Behind, torchlight flickered, illuminating the ranks of soldiers preparing for the final stand against the invading Mongol fleet. Dai Viet had faced such overwhelming odds before, and knew they likely would again. But tonight felt different, heavy with the weight of destiny, as if the fate of the entire nation rested on the turn of the tides and the beating of a single heart. Tran Hung Dao closed his eyes, letting the river sounds calm him. He could almost hear the distant creaking of enemy ships, still miles away, but approaching with the arrogance of a power that believed it could conquer any land. He imagined their sails, swelling like thunderclouds, their banners snapping the wind, their soldiers chanting their anticipated triumph. But the river had a voice, too, soft, wise, patient. He spoke quietly, almost to the river itself. Tomorrow, let your strength be our strength. A young captain approached, stopping respectfully 3 paces behind him. Phuong Tuong, the final preparations are complete. The stakes are fully set. Our small vessels are ready to engage when the tide turns. Tran Hung Dao opened his eyes. And the men? They are calm, sir. Determined. Good. He nodded slowly. They must trust the river, as much as they trust their commander. The captain hesitated. Do you truly believe the Yuan fleet will follow our lure into the river mouth? Tran Hung Dao glanced toward the dark horizon where the sea and sky blurred. They are angry, desperate. Their supplies are dwindling. Their retreat has been cut off. They will chase us because they believe that sheer numbers can overcome wisdom. He turned to face the young officer, his gaze deep and steady, reflecting compassion mixed with unwavering resolve. Remember this, he said. Strength without understanding is like a ship without a rudder. It may move quickly, but it does not know where it is going. The young captain bowed his head. Zets, tung tung. When the officer left, Tran Hung Dao returned his gaze to the river. He imagined the stakes beneath the water, standing firm against the relentless currents. Simple tools, rough with sharpened into deadly points, yet they represented something far greater. Preparation, patience, the wisdom of knowing when to act and when to wait. He had grown up near rivers like this one. As a boy, he had watched fishermen set traps in the shallow waters. Bamboo spikes, nets, currents cleverly manipulated. The fish, unsuspecting, would swim naturally into the snare, guided by their own instincts. He remembered once asking an old fisherman, "Why don't you chase them? Wouldn't that be faster?" The man had laughed. "Child, you don't chase the river. You let the river chase for you." Now, decades later, that lesson would guide the fate of an entire nation. Somewhere behind him, drums sounded softly as troops shifted. The faint glow of dawn had begun to touch the sky, painting streaks of pale silver above the horizon. Another officer approached, a veteran, older, with the calm face of someone who had witnessed too many wars. Phuong Tuong, the scouts have returned. The Yuan fleet is advancing. They will reach the outer mouth of the river by mid-morning. Tran Hung Dao nodded. Exactly as expected. The officer looked out at the river. Many of our soldiers have never fought an enemy as fearsome as this. Some still remember the stories from the north, how the Mongols conquered land after land. We are not those lands, Tran Hung Dao said softly. We know our rivers, our forests, our tides. And most important of all, he placed a hand over his chest, we know what we're fighting for. The officer bowed deeply and withdrew. As the first sliver of sunlight broke across the river's surface, the water glowed gold, revealing the faint shadows of the stakes far below. For a moment, the entire river seemed to hold a secret, waiting to be revealed at the perfect time. Tran Hung Dao whispered, "Let them come." He walked down toward the command boat waiting at the small dock. Fishermen's children stood nearby, watching him with wide eyes. Some held bundles of arrows. Others carried baskets of dried food. Though young, they understood that the coming day would decide whether their villages survived. One little boy tugged lightly at his sleeve. Phuong Tuong, will we win? Tran Hung Dao knelt, so the child wouldn't have to look so far up. His expression softened. What do you think? The boy hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. My father says the river fights with us. A smile touched the commander's lips. Your father is right. He gently placed a hand on the boy's head. Go home, stay with your mother, and trust the river. The child nodded and ran off. The command boat pushed off from the shore, gliding quietly across the surface. Soldiers saluted as Tran Hung Dao passed. Some murmured prayers. Others held their weapons tightly, not out of fear, but anticipation. Ahead, the river widened, stretching toward the sea like a giant gateway. The tide was still high, the stakes still hidden. Everything depended on timing. Tran Hung Dao looked to the east. On the shimmering horizon, faint dots appeared. Enemy sails catching the morning light. The Yuan fleet had arrived. He inhaled deeply, letting the river breeze fill his lungs. The day had come, and the river was ready. Morning rose slowly over Bach Dang, washing the river in pale gold. Mist drifted across the water like wandering spirits, wrapping the world in a soft, uncertain veil. But beneath that gentle veil, tension tightened like the string of a bow. Every soldier, every oarsman, every lookout, even the river itself, felt the weight of the coming clash. From his command boat, Tran Hung Dao watched the mist parting as the first ships of the Yuan fleet emerged on the horizon. They came like dark towers, their sails billowing as they struggled to catch the shifting wind. Their hulls creaked under the weight of thousands of armored men, and the distant sound of drums rolled across the water. The river seemed small in comparison, yet strangely calm, as if confident in its hidden strength. A messenger on a smaller boat rowed hard toward him. Tung Tung, the enemy vanguard has entered the outer channel. Tran Hung Dao nodded. Keep our ships moving backward, just enough to draw them in. The messenger saluted and turned his boat around. The Dai Viet fleet scattered in the distance. Sleek, light vessels designed to slip quickly across shallow waters. Their sails were furled. They relied mostly on paddles now, gliding backward like shadows, always staying just out of the enemy's reach. To the Yuan commanders watching from afar, it must have looked like a retreat. Predictable, panicked, exactly as Tran Hung Dao intended. Behind him, General Pham Ngo Lao spoke quietly. They're taking the bait. Phuong Tuong. They must. Tran Hung Dao replied, his eyes never leaving the Yuan fleet. When an army believes victory already belongs to them, they rush forward to claim it. The morning tide was still high. The deadly stakes beneath the river remained hidden. This was the crucial window. Those few hours in which the river appeared harmless even as it prepared its trap. As the Yuan ships approached, their commanders shouted orders that echoed across the water, harsh, metallic, full of urgency. Among their voices, Tran Hung Dao recognized the desperation of an invading army far from home, low on supplies and driven into a tight corner. To return home defeated meant punishment, shame, perhaps even death. So they would press forward, even into uncertainty. The first ranks of Yuan ships entered the narrowing mouth of the river. Their long, heavy hulls pushed waves aside, churning the water into white foam. Archers stood ready on their decks, scanning for targets. But the Dai Viet ship stayed just past their range, retreating slowly. General Tran Hung Dao approached from another command boat. Phuong Tuong, the tide will begin to fall within the hour. Good, Tran Hung Dao said. Have the signal flags prepared. When I give the order, our ships move to both flanks. The moment the river reveals its teeth, we strike. The older general nodded. And the fire squads? Ready. They only need the spark. For a few long minutes, nothing changed. The Yuan fleet advanced deeper into the river. The Dai Viet skirmish boats continued to pull back, paddles cutting steady rhythms into the current. The mist lifted more and more, revealing the dark silhouettes of mountains, standing silent like ancient witnesses. The river started to shift, barely noticeable at first. Just a slight pull, a change in the texture of the water. Soldiers on the boats felt it before they saw it. The steady rise of water slowed, paused, and began to fall. The tide was turning. Tran Hung Dao exhaled softly. The river has chosen. To the untrained eye, the next 30 minutes looked normal. But for those who knew Bach Dang, the transformation had already begun. The current sharpened. The water level sank slowly. Shadows beneath the surface stirred, growing closer, rising inch by inch toward the light. Thousands of deadly wooden stakes waited. The Yuan sailors noticed the shifting current, but dismissed it. They had no choice but to follow the command to advance. Their ships were too large, too heavy, too committed now to maneuver easily. One of the Yuan captains shouted an order, drums thundered, and their vanguard accelerated, seeking to ram the nearest Dai Viet boat. That was the signal Tran Hung Dao had been waiting for. He raised his hand. A soldier beside him unfurled a bright red flag. Then another. Across the river, flag signals mirrored his movements. General Pham Ngo Lao raised his arm, and the Dai Viet fleet split apart like wings opening wide. The light, agile boats surged to the left and right sides of the river, clearing the center. For the first time, the Yuan ship saw the river ahead with full clarity and saw nothing wrong. But they had already traveled too far. The water continued to fall. A sudden scraping sound tore through the silence. Sharp, jarring, unmistakable. A Yuan ship had struck something. Then another and another. The riverbed's hidden fangs were rising. Panic rippled through the Yuan ranks. Officers shouted. Rowers pushed desperately at their oars. Sailors leaned over the sides, trying to understand what they had hit. Tran Hung Dao watched the scene unfold with calm that belied the storm inside him. Not triumph, not excitement. Only a deep, steady resonance, like hearing a truth revealed at last. Beside him, Pham Ngo Lao whispered, "It begins." The tide sank further, exposing the first tips of the stakes. Dark, wet with glistening wickedly in the sun. A Yuan commander screamed an order, but it was too late. Their ships were wedged on the stakes, stuck fast. Some began to tilt as water receded, their heavy hulls cracking under their own weight. Tran Hung Dao raised his arm. Every Dai Viet soldier braced. "Now!" he commanded. His voice shot across the river like an arrow. War drums thundered. Hundreds of Dai Viet fireboats shot forward from the flanks, rowing with explosive speed. Archers ignited their arrows and drew their bows. The air hummed with tension, ready to burst into flame and fury. The river roared, not with water, but with men, with fire, with the awakening of a trap crafted by patience and wisdom. The Battle of Bach Dang had begun. Night fell slowly over the vast marshes surrounding the Bach Dang River, wrapping the landscape in a thick, tranquil darkness. But beneath that stillness, preparations continued relentlessly. The Dai Viet forces moved with disciplined quiet, each man aware that what they did tonight might determine the fate of the entire nation. Torches were covered, oars wrapped in cloth, armor muffled to avoid even the faintest metallic ring. Tran Quoc Tuan stood at the riverbank, watching as the tide continued to retreat. The exposed mudflats glistened faintly under the dim lantern light. From time to time, a soldier approached, kneeling to report progress. "General, the last row of stakes has been securely planted." Another added, "The iron tips are fastened. No enemy ship will survive the strike." The general nodded, his mind calm yet sharp. The river, the tides, the stakes, the narrow passages. Every detail of the coming battle had been woven into a single tapestry. But strategy alone could not win this war. It would take the courage of thousands, the trust of commanders, and the will of a whole nation to stand against the overwhelming Mongol fleet. Nearby, Tran Hung Dao, the renowned commander who had earlier disrupted Togon's supply lines, approached quietly. "My lord," he said, "their fleet will reach the lower river by dawn. Our scouts confirm they are moving faster than expected." "It doesn't matter," Quoc Tuan replied. "They will arrive with the tide, and the tide will be our ally." He walked along the bank, watching the stakes firmly hidden beneath the water's surface. These wooden pillars, sharpened and tipped with iron, were more than mere traps. They were a silent army waiting beneath the waves. When the tide rose, they vanished completely. When it fell, they would strike like fangs. Far downstream, the Yuan fleet advanced through the misty night. Their ships, large, broad, and formidable, cut across the water in tight formation. General Oh Ma Ni, one of the Mongol Empire's most experienced naval commanders, stood at the helm of his flagship. His eyes searched the dark horizon, trying to pierce the fog. His deputy approached. "General, the tide is rising. Our ships will reach the upper stretch of the river by sunrise." Oh Ma Ni nodded, though his expression was unreadable. He had chased the Dai Viet forces for weeks, crossing marshes and rivers, expecting to crush them quickly. But instead of weakening, they had grown more elusive, more deliberate. Every retreat had led him deeper into terrain unfamiliar to sailors. Still, he believed the end was near. The Vietnamese army had scattered, their capital abandoned. Victory seemed inevitable, but something gnawed at him. "This river," he muttered. "Its silence is strange." The deputy looked puzzled. "General?" Oh Ma Ni shook his head. "No matter. We advance at first light." Before dawn, mist rolled across the Bach Dang River like drifting smoke. Rows of mangroves appeared as shadowy forms, their branches stretching outward like silent guardians of the land. The water rose steadily, hiding the deadly stakes beneath its gentle surface. Dai Viet's forces waited in multiple positions, some concealed within the mangrove forest, others hidden upstream, while the main contingent remained near the river mouth. Light boats, agile and shallow-bottomed, drifted quietly, ready to provoke and lure the enemy. As the sky slowly brightened, the sound of drums echoed faintly from the distance. Yuan drums. Their fleet emerged like a dark line across the water, dozens of warships moving with heavy confidence, their sails swelling with the morning wind. Tran Tuan raised his hand. "Steady," he whispered. "Let them come to us." The first line of small Vietnamese boats advanced, rowing swiftly toward the enemy. They appeared to be attacking, but just as they neared the Mongol ships, they turned sharply, retreating upstream. From a distance, it looked like fear. Oh Ma Ni laughed. "They flee again. Press forward. Chase them." The Yuan war drums thundered as the fleet surged forward. Their heavy ships cut through the water, narrowing the distance between them and the smaller Vietnamese boats that darted ahead like flickering shadows. By mid-morning, the tide had reached its peak. The river ran wide and deep. All stakes were now fully submerged. The Vietnamese boats continued to withdraw swiftly, drawing the Mongol fleet deeper and deeper into the narrow section of the river. The Yuan commanders, eager for a decisive victory, paid no attention to the shifting currents or the unusually calm demeanor of their enemies. Suddenly, the retreating boat split into two separate columns, swerving into the mangrove-covered channels on either side. A Mongol officer shouted, "General, they are scattering." "No need to worry," Oh Ma Ni replied. "Follow the main stream. They cannot run forever." But moments later, the depth of the river began to change. The water slowed. The current twisted unnaturally. One Mongol helmsman frowned. "General, the river feels strange." Before Oh Ma Ni could respond, a distant horn sounded across the river, long, low, and ominous. It was a horn of Dai Viet. At that exact moment, the tide began to fall. The river level dropped rapidly, exposing the tops of hidden stakes just beneath the water's surface. A loud cracking sound echoed. Then another. A Yuan warship lurched violently to one side, its hull pierced from below. Before the crew could react, a second ship struck a cluster of stakes, shattering its hull. Panic spread across the fleet. "General, the river is filled with traps." Oh Ma Ni's eyes widened in shock. "Turn the ships. Turn them around at once." But the tide had already receded past the point of no return. The massive Mongol ships, so dominant on open sea, were helpless in the narrowing river channel, stuck in a maze of deadly stakes. Then came the roar. From both sides of the river, Dai Viet forces emerged like a rising storm. Their boats surged forward, surrounding the mobilized fleet. Arrows darkened the sky. Firepots flared. Drums thundered across the mangrove forest. Tran Tuan stood at the front line, raising his sword. The river is ours. Push forward. End this. The clash shook the Bach Dang River as the tide continued to fall, trapping the Mongol fleet deeper and sealing their fate. Far above the chaos, flocks of white egrets flew across the sky, circling as if witnessing an ancient rhythm unfolding. A rhythm where the land and its people became one. The battle that had just begun would soon carve its place into history. And the river continued to flow, as calm and silent as ever, even as destiny roared upon its waters. The dawn that rose over the Bach Dang River on that fateful morning was not gentle. It was sharp, cold, metallic, like a blade being drawn across the sky. And beneath that blade, the water churned with a strange tension, as if the river itself sensed the storm about to descend. General Tran Tuan stood silently on a high bank, his armor reflecting the muted light, his breath slow and steady. He had waited months for this moment, the moment when the Mongol fleet would commit itself fully, blindly, fatally. He lowered his gaze to the river, where the tide was still high enough to hide what he had buried beneath. The stakes. Thousands of them, sharpened, angled, and embedded deep into the muddy riverbed like the jaws of an ancient beast waiting to devour. This morning, that beast would feast. Behind him, the Dai Viet soldiers tightened their grips on spears and bows. They were calm, almost unnervingly so, because they knew this battlefield wasn't just theirs. It belonged to the river, the tide, the land, and every ancestor who had ever stood here against invaders. The Mongols came with certainty. The Vietnamese waited with patience. Suddenly, muffled horns echoed from downstream. The Mongols were coming. The river trembled beneath the roar of their oars. One ship became 10. 10 became 50. 50 became a black mass of warships, crowding the horizon like a thundercloud. Commanding them was the infamous General Ni, standing tall on the deck of his flagship, eyes scanning the riverbanks with suspicion. But all he saw were quiet hills, scattered trees, and a few Viet boats drifting lazily as if they had no intention of resisting. Cowards, he muttered. He didn't know he was staring directly at a trap. He didn't know the quiet was intentional. He didn't know the river was waiting. The Mongol fleet advanced aggressively, believing victory was close enough to grasp. Their oars tore through the water with precise, thunderous rhythm. The splash of each stroke was like a war drum, hammering toward the inevitable. Tran Tuan watched it all with an emotionless expression, not a flicker of fear, only focus. He murmured to himself, "Closer, just a little closer." The Mongol ships surged forward, narrowing the distance to the waiting Dai Viet fleet that hovered seemingly aimless near upstream. The Vietnamese boats began retreating, a tactic Ni had seen before. He laughed. They flee again. They always flee. But he didn't notice the tide. He didn't know it had already begun to shift, the water slowly pulling back, inch by inch, revealing the first hint of something unnatural beneath. A soldier on a Mongol ship frowned. "General, the water, it seems." Forward. "Oh, my niece, not pet." The Mongols pushed on. Then crack. The sound cut through the river like thunder. A Mongol ship lurched violently. Another crack. Another jolt. Another ship's hull split open like ripped bark. Confusion erupted through the fleet. What is happening? The river is filled with spikes. But by the time they realized it, it was too late. The tide had retreated just enough to expose the sharpened stakes, and the Mongol ships impaled themselves one after another. With shattered, men screamed, and flags toppled into chaotic waves. The entire fleet writhed in panic as ship after ship slammed into the deadly forest hidden beneath the surface. On the riverbank, Tran Tuan raised his arm. Now, drums boomed, horns blared, and with a roar that shook the air, the Dai Viet fleet, which had been retreating moments earlier, suddenly turned around. The river ignited with motion. Hundreds of small, agile Viet boats surged forward, cutting through the water like arrows released from a bowstring. Soldiers leapt up, their eyes blazing with the fire defending their homeland. Archers fired volleys that darkened the sky. Spearmen thrust from low boats with deadly precision. The Mongols, trapped, immobilized, and unable to maneuver their massive ships, became helpless targets. Ni realized the truth at last. He had walked straight into a masterpiece of strategy crafted by a mind far superior to his. Rage stormed inside him, but fear followed closely behind. "Cut the stakes. Break free," he shouted. But how could they? The river was tearing their fleet apart. Some ships were already sinking, swallowed by the mud. Others tilted dangerously, their decks flooded with frantic soldiers. Then the current shifted again. The tide was now rushing out rapidly, pulling the Mongol ships deeper into the trap. It was no longer a battle. It was annihilation. Through the chaos, Tran Quoc Tuan's voice echoed like a command from the heavens. "For Dai Viet, for our river." The Vietnamese struck with precision, like a storm of blades, like the river itself had taken form in human hands. They moved as if, guided by the very essence of the land. It was as if the spirit of Bach Dang had patiently waited centuries, finally finding its voice to the Vietnamese warriors. Seen from above, the battle resembled a furious vortex, with Mongol ships ensnared and floundering against the swift and graceful movements of the Dai Viet boats. The cacophony was deafening. The sharp crack of hulls being torn apart, the thundering rush of water, the metallic clang of clashing steel, the desperate screams of the invaders, and the deep rumble of war drums reverberating across the valley. The Mongol fleet was collapsing, each shattered ship marking another step toward their utter defeat. Amidst the growing pandemonium, Omani desperately tried to rally his remaining officers, but a sense of hopelessness had already taken hold. They realized they weren't just fighting the Vietnamese army. They were battling the river itself, the relentless tide, the very land beneath their feet. Everything, it seemed, was conspiring against them. As flames erupted and spread rapidly across the sinking vessel's thick, dark smoke billowed into the sky like a mournful funeral shroud. The sun, obscured behind the smoke, cast an eerie twilight over the river. In that smoky, dim light, Tran Quoc Tuan stood resolute on his command boat, his cloak whipped around him by the wind, his eyes sharp and unwavering. The river had awakened, its hidden power unleashed. The trap had sprung shut. The invaders were falling, one by one, and the battle was far from over. The smoke drifted low over the Bach Dang River, swirling like dark spirits above the wreckage of the Mongol fleet. The tide had receded, revealing long stretches of mud on either side, glistening under the harsh daylight. Broken ships lay impaled on the hidden stakes like fallen beasts, their hulls ripped open, their decks flooded, their flags lost beneath the churning water. But the battle was not yet completely won. Across the river, the surviving Mongol soldiers clung desperately to any floating debris they could find. Some attempted to swim toward the banks, only to be met by deadly volleys of arrows unleashed by the hidden Dai Viet archers waiting patiently above. Others tried to regroup on the few ships that remained afloat, their shouted orders lost in the overwhelming chaos that the river swallowed without mercy. On a command boat, Tran Quoc Tuan remained still, his cloak snapping sharply in the rising wind. He watched as the final stage of the battle approached, the moment when the tide, the river, and the Dai Viet forces would converge to bring an irreversible end to the invasion. "Advance!" he ordered calmly, his voice cutting through the noise. The Dai Viet fleet surged forward once more, not with a frantic burst of the earlier assault, but with controlled and decisive force. Every movement was calculated. The Mongols were already defeated in spirit. Now it was time to seal their physical fate. The Vietnamese boats surrounded the last pockets of resistance, forming a tightening circle. Their small vessels bobbed lightly on the water, agile and unburdened, while the remaining Mongol ships groaned under their own weight, trapped like prey cornered on a battlefield where even the ground itself had turned against them. Arrows rained down, spears thrust forward, shields clattered, and the river roared its approval. Omani, soaked, bloodied, but still burning with a desperate fury, screamed at his men to fight. His voice cracked, betraying the weight of defeat. Break through. Kill them. Swim if you must. Just get to land. But the eyes of his soldiers had changed. Gone was the fierce determination. Now, they were haunted by dread. Many had heard the old tales of this place. Stories of No Gwyn and his legendary victory 4 centuries earlier, when another invading fleet had been destroyed by these very waters. Now, they were reliving that same nightmare, trapped by what felt like destiny itself. As the Vietnamese forces closed in, Tran Quoc Tuan raised his sword high. It gleamed like a captured ray of sunlight, trembling with the same hunger the river seemed to feel. Finish it. His voice was steady, devoid of anger or hatred. Only duty remained, the duty of protecting a homeland that had suffered far too many invasions. Then came the final, decisive clash. The Vietnamese attacked with overwhelming precision and ferocious courage. They climbed onto the Mongol decks, their feet splashing through pools of blood and water. They fought with the calm ferocity of men who knew the land beneath them fought alongside them. Shields collided with brutal force. Blades sliced through the air. Arrows flew at point-blank range. Mongol officers fell one after another. Some resisted fiercely, swinging their heavy blades in wide, desperate arcs. Others, exhausted and demoralized, simply dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, their spirits crushed more by the river's betrayal than by any human hand. The sky grew even darker as the smoke thickened, billowing upward like a storm rising from the water. The air stung with salt and ash. Each breath tasted of iron and burning wood. Finally, Omani abandoned his ship, leaping into the river in a desperate attempt to escape. He and a handful of his remaining officers swam frantically toward the deeper channels where the hidden stakes could not reach. Behind him, the once feared Mongol fleet, an armada that had terrorized continents, lay in utter ruin. When he reached deeper water, he grabbed onto a floating plank, panting heavily, his eyes wide with disbelief. How could this be? How could the seemingly invincible Mongol Empire be brought to its knees here, on a muddy riverbank at the edge of the world? He turned to look back one last time, but what he saw was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard of ships, of flags, of ambitions, of arrogance. And standing above it all, watching calmly for his command boat, was Tran Hung Dao, the man who had defeated him not once, but twice, first with brilliant strategy, and then with the relentless power of the river itself. As the Mongol remnants fled downstream in utter disarray, the Dai Viet soldiers cheered triumphantly, their voices echoing like thunder across the valley. They had accomplished the impossible. They had crushed the greatest military power of the age. But Tran Hung Dao did not join in the cheering. He simply breathed long and deep, allowing the tension of months to finally leave his body. The river was quiet now. The stakes, once hidden beneath the surface, now rose fully from the retreating tide. Thousands of dark, sharp silhouettes standing like the teeth of a sleeping leviathan, satisfied with its prey. Behind him, his officers gathered, their faces filled with awe. "Phuong Tuong," one said softly, using Tran Hung Dao's honorific title. "The enemy has been annihilated." "Yes," he replied, his voice filled with quiet strength. "But remember, this victory belongs not to us alone." He gazed out at the river. This battlefield fought alongside us. A profound silence settled over them. A heavy, sacred silence, as if the spirits of the land, the souls of their ancestors, and the river itself were listening. "The invaders believed they could conquer the world," he continued, "but they never truly understood this place. They never understood that Dai Viet's true strength does not come from sheer numbers or advanced weaponry." He touched the hilt of his sword. "It comes from knowing the land, respecting the tides, and fighting with the spirit and determination of our ancestors." The officers bowed deeply in respect. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, turning the smoke into a hazy, blood-red curtain, the soldiers began the solemn task of gathering the wounded, tending to the fallen, and slowly withdrawing victorious from the battlefield. Behind them, the river flowed once more in its quiet, timeless rhythm, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But history would never forget. For on that day, in the year 1288, the Bach Dang River became more than just a geographical location. It became a symbol, a living testament to the fact that even the mightiest empire could be defeated by a smaller nation that fought with intelligence, unity, and unbreakable resolve. And as the Dai Viet fleet drifted homeward, their banners fluttering proudly in the wind, the river whispered its ancient secret. Those who respect the land will be protected by the land. Those who seek to invade will ultimately be swallowed by it.